Well, hello everybody and welcome to my show. My name is Jason DaCosta and this is Consistent Preterism. Thank you for joining me today. Today I'm just going to be doing a brief talk on the topic of this idea that God dispersed the Israelites into the nations for the purpose of saving the pagan nations through those dispersions. Okay. Now, before I did that, I just want to talk for a second about this new peace treaty between Israel and whoever it was between. I don't even know. But all I know is that there's been some chatter in the wackadoodle dispensational camps about how this is prophetic and this means something and, the peace treaty, right? We've heard about the peace deals for like decades, right? This is biblical. There's a peace deal going on. Give me a break, okay? Give me a break. The only people who are pointing to some prophetic peace treaty are the people who don't know their Bibles. Someone close to me had mentioned it recently, a few days ago, saying, this is biblical, this is a peace treaty. And so I very quickly came back and I said, okay. I said, very, very politely, I said, would you be able to show me what passages talk about this? And the person looked at me and said, well, no, but I just know it in my heart. And I said, okay, well, if you think this is a prophetic biblical passage, then clearly you must know what biblical passage this comes from, and you'd be able to point to it, right? So I could take a look at it. And the person didn't have any idea where it came from. And so, not a knock on anybody, but, if you're going to point to a newspaper event, we call it newspaper, newspaper exegesis. You pick up the newspaper, you open it up, you find something that looks remotely similar to something that you misinterpreted in the Bible, and you point to it and say, this is it. That's what people do. So, excuse me. So if you're out there and you're listening and you know of the particular passages that the dispensationalists point to prove there's going to be a peace treaty at the end of time, well, someone please comment and point that out to me. Because now that I understand what the Bible is talking about, specifically the book of Revelation, which is where I think they get this nonsense from, it's very, very easy to just kind of smack that stuff away. I mean, all one has to do is take notice of the time statements that all these things in this book would shortly come to pass. And they would all take place very soon. And they were all very close. And they were all at the door. And they were all on the cusp of happening back when this was written. So by that default alone, you're eliminated from the game. This peace deal that Trump made has nothing to do with you by that alone. We don't even have to look at what the story actually says. We don't even have to, pinpoint and connect all the dots to show you that Old Covenant Jerusalem was the mother of all harlots. She was the city where the Lord was slain. Hello. And that was who was going to fall. And that was who was going to be judged because she was drunk with the blood of the prophets. Jesus came to Jerusalem and wept for the city and said, Jerusalem, Jerusalem, how I wish you would turn to me. But you soon be left, you'll be left with no stones left standing upon another, or whatever it is that he says. So Jesus was lamenting over Jerusalem's soon-to-come demise. And by golly, that's exactly what Revelation speaks of in this apocalyptic type of book. So there is no peace treaty, biblical, prophetic thing going on. You can rest assured of that, okay? If you think you know a passage that might prove any kind of peace treaty, go ahead and throw it up on the comments here in this video, and I'll be sure to take a look at it. Just take a look at it. Remember that video, that guy? Just take a look at it. I'll be sure to take a look at it, and we'll go from there. But anyways, what I wanted to talk about, okay? There's this view in Christianity. It's probably a minority view, like everything else, but it's a view that sometimes is used against the IO viewpoint, and that view says that yes, they acknowledge that the Israelites were out in the nations and that Israelites were being gathered in or are being gathered in. I guess they would have to say Israelites are still being gathered in, right? Because if they're a Christian today and they're looking forward to a future end, like Jason Staples is, the guy that I reviewed a little bit the other day, if they're a Christian, then they still believe that Israel's being saved, right? Because the fullness of the nations has not come in yet. If they think that they're part of the salvation narrative, then they're part of the nations, right? That's just the only way it could work, right? They're part of the nations. So the fullness of the nations hasn't come in yet, according to a futurist Christian. Therefore, all Israel has not been saved yet, according to Romans 11. Because all Israel couldn't be saved until the fullness of the nations came in. And so you have this viewpoint that says, well, yeah, sure, Israelites are out in the nations and they're still coming in, right? Now, mind you, okay, let me just throw something at you here so that you can see the deep-rooted levels of inconsistencies in these views, okay? The futurist Christian, such as Jason Staples or anyone else for that matter, like I just said, they would have to agree that the fullness of the nations has not come in yet, because they're obviously out here in the nations, right? And they're supposedly thinking that they're coming in. So they'd agree that the fullness of the nations hasn't come in yet, which means, by default, that all Israel has not been saved. Okay, now they would look at the two as two different groups. But did you ever stop and consider that when people are opposing the IO viewpoint, they oppose the IO viewpoint with an argument that sounds a lot like this? Well, you mean to tell me that 700, 800, 900 years later, there's still Israelites living in the first century out in those nations? Right? This guy is obviously from like Alabama or Arkansas or something, Two-Tooth Billy. And he says, there's no way those Israelites could have been existing out in those nations some 700 years later in the first century. No way. That's just not possible. Hold on one second. A girl just darted out in front of me with no regard for human life whatsoever. So that's their argument, that there's no way Israelites could still be out in the nations existing. But guess what? If you are a futurist and you're thinking that you're a Christian and you're thinking that you're a Gentile who has been gathered in, then according to Romans 11, there would still be Israelites out in the nations today. Think about that. In 2020, some 2,000 years after the first century, when this all came to an end, to the futurists, there are still Israelites coming in today. There would have to be. Because remember, in Romans 11, they take Gentile and Israel, the fullness of the Gentiles, and all Israel saved, as two different things. Most of them. Okay? Most of them. So what that means is that they, by default, believe that there's still Israelites existing out in the nations today, 2,000 years after the fact. They have to. They just probably not smart enough to realize what that actually means, right? But yet they'll argue that 500, 600, 700 years is too long for God to preserve his people when they're objecting IO. I hope you pick up on that, because that's a big, big, big problem. If you're going to use the argument that that it was too long for the Israelites to still be in existence, untarnished, out in the nations, then you're going to have a real hard time if you're a futurist Christian who thinks that you've been brought in and who thinks that the Gentiles of Romans 11 are different than the all Israel saved. Okay, I hope you get it. If you don't, leave a comment. I'll try to explain it better, but it's totally inconsistent. You have them arguing against a 500 or 600 year period of the Israelites still being able to be existing out in the nations, but yet all along they don't realize that their very view that they hold demands that Israelites have been in existence now for some 2,000 years. Right? They're just not picking up on that. But back to what I wanted to say here. Does it make any sense? Here's the main point of this video. I know I kind of go off on little side trails and whatnot, but does it make any sense whatsoever that God, this God of this Bible, would have to disperse his people into the nations just so that he could bring salvation to the pagans. Think about this now. This is the argument. Well, God dispersed the northern kingdom. He scattered the northern kingdom for the purpose of blessing all of these pagan nations through their scattering. Right? I mean, to me, okay, if the God of all creation wanted to save pagans, right? And I don't believe this God is the God of all creation. I'm calling him what the Bible calls him, and I'm calling him what the Christians call him. If the God of all creation of this Hebrew Bible wanted to save pagans, why did he have to go through such a ridiculously warped, plan of attack? I mean, so you scatter the Israelites out into the nations for the purpose of gathering the pagans in. I can picture God now. He's thinking up there. He's in heaven. He's chilling. He's having a beer, and he's thinking to himself, man, how can I save those pagans? Right? How can I get salvation to those pagans? I got it. I'll punish my own people. I'll send my own people to the nations. And then later on, I'll set forth a salvation mission, and I'll gather in both my people and the true pagans. Yes, that's very good. Very good indeed. And then he rested. Okay? It makes no sense. All right? Look, if this God wanted to save all people, he would have done so. If this God wanted to send a salvation mission out to the pagans, he would have done so. He didn't need to scatter his people out into the nations to do so. That's a dumb theory. It's a very dumb theory. And I can see how people might arrive at that theory when they're struggling to hold on to a piece of the story. Jason Staples is coming up a lot this audio. Nothing against the guy, but it just reminds me of his view. His view is much of the same. He says that, yes, he agrees that Paul was calling Israelites back in his letters. And it's clear from places like Romans 9 that the Gentiles who God was having mercy upon were actually the lost tribes of Israel. But yet, right alongside that, he invents this other narrative that says, but wait, there's more. The real reason, or one of the reasons why God did this was so that he could save other people alongside of Israel. But as we know, the story doesn't say that. The story is very exclusive. The story says he only came for Israel. The story says it was only Israel standing in heaven at the end. The story is so bold as to even say at the very end, when they're in their new city, that nothing unclean shall ever enter in. I think that's Revelation 21 or 22. Nothing, imagine that. So here they are. They're in their new city. Okay. Jesus uses the parable saying the door is shut. So you can almost imagine, like, they're in their new city. It's only for the 12 tribes. The door is shut and nothing unclean will ever enter in. Now, if you know what unclean means in the Bible and the biblical story, and to Jews and, to the law and everything, well, you get a good idea of what that means, right? That, to me, screams covenant exclusivity. Nothing unclean shall ever enter in. Okay? Now, you can take that how you want it, but I know how I take it. I take it as this story is 100% Israel only, and the final scenes in heaven prove that 150%. But I just wanted to bring those things to your attention so you could think on them a little bit. The first one being how any futurist Christian could argue against I.O. that Israelites were still out in the nations in the first century, even though there is historical proof for that. Josephus, the book of the Maccabees, the New Testament, hello. But yet they turn around and they believe that somehow Israelites are being saved today, 2,000 years later. Inconsistency at its finest. And then the other aspect was what I just talked about. Basically, how realistic and how necessary would it have been for God to take this approach? In other words, he could have done it a lot easier, right? I mean, it doesn't make sense to have to scatter your people in order to save the pagans. That doesn't make any sense. We all know the real reason why his people were scattered. If you read the Old Testament, you can see that clearly. They were disobedient. They were wicked. They violated the covenant terms. They didn't hold the law to the proper esteem. They didn't obey the commandments. And these were all things that were outlined for them at the start through Moses when he warned them that they would be cursed. They would be cursed. Okay, so it all relates to Israel. It relates to their inability to do the right thing. And this is all punishment from their God to them. Like he says in, I think it's Amos, I will punish you, Israel, for your sins. Right? Because they were held to the higher standard. They had the law, and they had the imputation of sin and guilt, and they would be judged by that law at the final judgment. No other nation had that law, according to the Bible. So no other nation was judged at the final judgment. It's just that simple. Folks, I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you all have a great day. If you're a troll, take a hike. If you're one of those wackadoodle spiritual people who like to say that the Bible means something that it really doesn't, you can go take a hike as well. Don't forget to bring pepper spray in case you get mauled by a bear. And I hope you all have a wonderful, lovely day. Don't forget to give it a like, a Rooski, and we'll catch you on that flippity floppity. Take care, everyone. Bye-bye.